Appreciate this opportunity. I thank the organizers for putting together this conference and putting a very fine program. It started very early this morning for me, and I know it's very late for our chair right now, and he has been going right from the morning, very early. Thank you so much. I'll be talking to you about something that we've been hearing about a lot, just getting to zero emissions, and we have to decarbonize the system. And why aren't the slides proceeding? There it is. I'm going to give my bottom line up front, which is that we do need nuclear power. I see no way around it. The premise of this talk, and this is has a large background to it, but I am not going to discuss this. I take it as a starting point that the climate change is real. It's not a hoax. It is happening. It is happening right now. And then the main driver for the climate change that we are all facing is energy consumption. Energy use is absolutely essential for our sustenance, yet 80% of it is derived from fossil sources, which end up producing the CO2 and other greenhouse gases, which are the drivers of the climate change. And is absolutely urgent that we start acting now. That's what the science has been showing us. Maybe less clearly 15 years ago when I first started on the book, but much more urgently right now. In fact, I heard someone describe that we shouldn't think of last 5 years as the hottest in the century, but the coldest in the next century. It's that important. So what's the path forward? One path forward that's been talked about a lot, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is to electrify everything. Electricity has got all exergy. It's pure exergy, as one of the speakers earlier talked about. And that means not just the transportation, but also the industry, the built environment, the metals, our entire environment, the housing, how we heat and cool, all those. But that increases the amount of carbon-free electricity that we have to produce. We have to produce that in commensurate amounts to allow everybody to lead healthy, productive lives. Because not producing enough has got high cost also. That cost being human potential is lost. And it's trying to balance the need for the extra energy that is needed along with the need to restrict carbon emissions brings me to the conclusion that we do need to expand our nuclear power fleet substantially. So that's what I will be focusing on. I'll show you what the problems have been. So yes, the CO2 emissions by sector, as we can see, there's, I have not put electricity production as a separate sector because we don't, it's the services that the electricity provide that we need. So whether it goes into industry or transportation or whatever. So let's look at the CO2 emissions by the end use. Transportation, industry are the two real big ones, along with building operations. That means how we heat and cool our buildings, HVAC systems and stuff like that, as well as building materials, the steel and the concrete and stuff like that. Agriculture is also part of that, and I haven't broken that out in this one. But it takes energy to climb up on human development index developed by the United Nations. The HDI scale, it is a composite of life expectancy, per capita gross national income, education, all these factors go into it. And this on the composite index, let's see, can you see my pointer go up? I don't know, but there are many countries, many people here, large populations of the world living in rather low energy consumption mode, and commensurately they have very low, they're low on the human development index also. A desirable human development index, of course, would be about 0.9 or above. That's what we want to achieve. And by the time you get to that, the energy consumption, per capita energy consumption in the country, at the country level, has to be on the equivalent of about 1,000 gallons of oil per year. This is for all energy, not just the gasoline for driving cars, but I've taken the primary energy used in any country and expressed it in gallons of oil equivalent on an individual basis. That made a little more sense to me. You can find more about it in my other works. I'll talk about that. So that's what we want to get to. So let's estimate what the energy requirement would be by mid-century. Let's assume for this analysis a population of 9 billion people. And if the desired per capita energy consumption to ensure an HDI of about 0.9 is 1,000 gallons of oil equivalent per year, which is still about half the consumption of US, comparable to that in Europe and Japan. It translates to about 9 trillion gallons. Or if some of you who may have seen my other works, which is the cubic mile oil, that's my other favorite unit, it's more than 8 cubic miles of oil worth of energy. But we are talking about it going all electric, so I'm going to dispense with the gallons and cubic miles and go straight over to electrical units. So in an all electric scenario, we would take the 9 trillion gallons and then try to convert that into kilowatt hours. And I'm going to use the exergy part of it. And in that analysis, 1 gallon of oil is not equal to 40 kilowatt hours, but only 12 kilowatt hours. That means 9 trillion gallons, I need about 108,000 terawatt hours. That's about 4.5 times the current global electricity production. If we try to achieve that with this installed capacity of something that is 100% available all the time, comes to a 12.3 or 14, between the 12 and 14 terawatt of capacity. That's what is needed. And if you want to look at the required investment over 30 years, that would translate to, again, it depends on what your installation cost is. And I'm using a very rough number of $5. So on the high price, $5 per watt of installed capacity. That will translate to about $60 trillion, but over 30 years, it means $2 trillion a year, or about 2.7% of gross world product, which I believe is a stretch, but it's doable. It can be done, so that's the hope part of it. And by the way, if we start building things, the dollar value for many other systems, like a natural gas plant, is of course much less. It's barely $1 a watt, and for installation for solar and wind are about $2 a watt or less. So this is a high number that I'm using over here. But one of the big challenge for an all renewable scenario is that wind and solar are intermittent sources. The capacity factor, that means the time they are up and running, is less than 30%. And that increases the requirement for the installed capacity. So instead of being installed capacity of 12 terawatts, now you're looking at between 30 and 40 terawatts. And second, these sources require a lot of materials in terms of iron, steel, concrete, glass, all kinds of basic raw materials. And when you multiply the things to get to the installed capacity needed for the world, and I'm looking at a global scale here, it really strains the supply chains tremendously. I'll show you how much. And then intermittency requires that there should be a commensurate amount of storage. We don't want storage just on a small scale, but on terawatt hour scale. This is currently being done mostly by spinning gas reserves, spinning reserves of gas-fired turbines, because they can speed up to speed very quickly. So that's why they are desired, because the intermittent sources go up and down fairly quickly, and something has to be able to follow them fairly rapidly. So that's why it's gas turbine, but the gas turbines have got CO2 emissions, and we want to get to zero. In fact, if analysis has shown that the greenhouse gas emissions from a combined cycle natural gas turbine would be much better. It's even less than a combination of photovoltaic system with a natural gas fired spinning reserve. So instead of going from installing photovoltaics and the backup, you're better off just taking the money and putting it into a combined cycle natural gas. Your overall emissions would be less, although it still not be zero. And then industrial development really requires power to be supplied 100% of the time. You don't have industries going offline very often. That's really stranded assets. Let's look at the amount of materials, as I mentioned. This is from the Department of Energy's quarterly reviews. It shows the mass of materials in tons. This is metric tons per terawatt hour of energy produced by any of these systems. Solar photovoltaics, the totals come up to more than 15,000 tons, metric tons per terawatt hour. Nuclear is actually a lot less. It's about 1/16 of that. Compared to wind, it's about 1/10 of that. So that's what happens. And if you look at what it means, it's a sealed requirement. If I consider just that the lower end of the total terawatts installed, 30 terawatts for the world, then the amount of steel that is needed in the world would be 25,000 million metric tons, or 25 billion metric tons, gigatons. If I'm going to do that in a 10-year to ramp up, because we want to get to zero by 2030 or something, very quickly, or start building up fast, that's still 2,500 million metric tons a year. After that, because these have relatively short life cycles for these are barely about 20 years, that means about 5% of it has to be replaced every year, or 1,250 million metric tons of every year have to be replaced. Now just compare, for comparison's sake, the current steel production in the whole world is only 1,900 million metric tons. That was the latest figure I had from a couple of years ago. Last year was very low because of COVID. So we are looking at about 2 gigatons of material production for steel, but we are requiring, that is being used for bridges, that's used for automobiles, that's used for a million other uses, but we need almost all of it to go into making just for the PV systems. The other requirement for the scenarios is the area requirements. It's fairly large also, just for wind, for example, to require for the 20 terawatt of wind that we will need, it comes down to about 5 million square kilometers. This is for the world, but I'm just for the sake of reference, I'm just showing you this. What does 5 million square kilometers look like? It's about half the size of the US. Now, on a whole scale board, I can draw little squares as people have done and show that the total area required is a small amount. It's not that large. Actually, it is, because you have to look at whose area are we talking about and what are we encroaching in. There are no really free things. There's always there. We have a very large environmental footprint is what it comes out. You are either removing trees from the ridges, which are the prime locations for installing the windmills, and there are other land use changes, or you are encroaching into the habitats for various wildlife and things like that. When we are looking at encroaching these things, or habitats, that also increases the risk of humans coming in contact with the wild animals and the risk of pandemics. That's one of the things that happens. And we really want to be minimizing it. It's not just for the installing, then also for the digging, for producing the iron and the steel and the glass, the mining that goes on, and that increases lead to very high environmental footprint. And nuclear has got a much lower environmental footprint. Battery storage is the other thing. People say, well, I didn't talk about hydro. Hydro, you could, but there isn't that much hydro available. If you look at the total world system, that how much it's available and how many terawatt hours you can produce, and you will have to install many more dams and closer to the installations where you are going to. You can't just, otherwise you have to have very high, long distance, high power transmission, which we don't have at the moment. And it could be done, but it's not easy. And I looked at the analysis by Jacobson when they talk about the hydro as one of the components in the thing. I noticed in the US case, they were getting about 10 or 12 times the capacity about hydro from the current fleet. So how did it get to be 7? They said we'll just install more turbines, but have the total flow the same. To me, that stretches credulity. Let me take one example of a 30 terawatt system that we have for the world, and 100 hours only. That's just a little over 4 days of storage. It's not a lot. I just last couple of weeks ago, I had 4 days of power outage here because of an ice storm. Nowhere near like what happened in Texas, but here in Oregon, where I am, the slide in the beginning did show that I was in San Francisco. I moved. We're now in Oregon. Anyhow, not to digress, the lithium required, lithium ion batteries, they store energy at the rate of, the materials is, each megawatt hour requires about 260 tons. So I need 980 million metric tons for the 3,000 terawatt hours of storage. The global production of lithium last year, in 2019, was only 0.06 million metric tons. 60,000 metric tons is what the production was. So we have to jump from 60,000 to 980. That's a huge jump. So the amount of lithium that is being produced right now, the 60,000 metric tons, is barely enough for 5 million Nissan cars, Nissan Leaf cars. And the global fleet is about 2 billion cars. So again, there's an orders of magnitude difference between what's needed. I'm not saying that there isn't enough lithium in the world, no. But to scale it up quickly, that's the reason I said, well, we got to do something that we have. So all the benefits of the nuclear fuel that I talk about, they really stem from the enormously high energy density. Nuclear has about 16,000 times the energy density of coal. Here I'm showing it on a linear scale. It's in a cartoon. The energy of fuel density of sugar. So this is in megajoules per kilogram. Sugar, coal, fat. Yeah, it's a lot more energy than the carbohydrates. Gasolines are really good, 46 megajoules. But uranium, just the paper, it's about 76 million megajoules. This high energy density means a much smaller environmental footprint. And consequently, nuclear has among the lowest CO2 emissions. This is the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour electricity produced. Nuclear has the lowest amount compared to all other things, including wind, as residential PV or utility PV or any other. Safety is the other. Excuse me. If you look at the fatalities caused per unit energy and normalize it to that, nuclear has the safest energy record of all. Coal ends up killing about 160 people per terawatt hour of energy it produces, that you get electricity that's produced. It's actually ranges from about 130 or even lower all the way to 200, depending on where you are in the world, whether you are using after after combustion cleanup treatments. And it dropped. Oil is much safer relative to that. Natural gas is much safer. These are really small. But look at the nuclear. 0.04 was the original graph, which was produced by the next big energy future. That was based on the Nuclear Energy Agency's estimate from the debts, future debts from Chernobyl, which they estimated to be about 4,000. In 2008, the UN body that looks at the radiation damage and all that, they came up that, well, future deaths are going to be undetectable, basically, and those that they drop. So now it is 0.0013 fatalities per terawatt hour. So when we turn off nuclear and put in any natural gas or anything other plants, we're actually increasing fatalities in the world. It's really an urgent task in front of us. And I want to wrap up very quickly. I want to leave time for some questions here. But from my perspective, the biggest task we face is to overcome the public opposition to nuclear power. And I suspect that it's a long haul. It takes time. But I hope that somehow in the Department of Energy, they can create an Office of Energy Education and Public Outreach to start educating people about the real deaths, that the radiation fear that we have is really unfounded. We live in an environment of radiation. The ambient, but there's no reason to make the nuclear so expensive. We have to stop closing the functioning nuclear power plants. We are already in a hole, and we keep digging ourselves deeper by closing nuclear power plants. One way to help the nuclear power plants compete would be to give them the nuclear power plants the same credits for green energy, for clean energy that's afforded the renewables. And we should have to start building the newer walk-away safe plants, smaller ones and modular ones, which can be scaled, which because they're factory built, there's a potential that they could even once we start building, there'll be learning by experience, and costs do come down. It's because we haven't built anything that things seem to be costing so much. Another major task that I would urge the Department of Energy and FERC and other bodies to be looking at is to fix the current electricity pricing. Auctions based on marginal cost skew the market tremendously and decrease the reliability of the grid. There's just not what happened in Texas. This just right now is also, there was no reliability being built because there was no body over there that was charged with really maintaining the reliability. ERCOT is supposed to be, but minimal. They don't have the powers. It's all distributed between the state, and other, and they say, okay, we'll just go with the cost, and the auctions, when they do the auctions, certain things come down very low, and they are the only ones that get built, but nobody wants to build the reliability part of it. And then we have to there's a lot more innovation needed as we do to electrify everything. And so new processes for steel, cement, and fuels, but they will all, underlying those productions is the need for energy. It keeps on adding. So I want to thank you for your attention. I hope I made my case here. That's the book, A Cubic Mile of Oil. It's not about oil, it's really about energy. A cubic mile of oil is just a metric of how much of global energy. That year, the world uses 1 cubic mile just from oil, but on top of that uses a cubic mile oil worth of energy from coal and about that much from natural gas and other sources. I welcome you to come to my blog where you will find more updates to the book as well as my presentations and talks that are there. And the book was really meant to be informative. It's like a general public's education about energy. It was more of descriptive. Nowadays, I am much more prescriptive and changed my stance. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be glad to take some questions from you.